Once I met a guy in his 30s, and in the course of the conversation, it turned out that we have cottages in the same cottage cooperative. The guy walked around for a long time, and then he asked me if I had noticed anything strange in the neighborhood. When I answered in the negative, he stopped talking and tried to shift the conversation to another topic. But I was already intrigued and managed to get a mind-blowing story out of him, after which I was completely reluctant to go there and in general to spend the night outside the city. Further, the story will be conducted on behalf of that guy. My parents bought this cottage for a pretty decent sum. They lived in it for 2 seasons, improved it as much as possible, planted a garden, and even dug a small pool under the apple trees. But then the mother died, and the cottage was abandoned for a couple of years. In time, the father recovered and went back there again. 4 years later, however, he died too. They found him in the house with his heart stopped. Heart attack, the paramedics said. I didn't take much interest in the cottage, but I visited it occasionally, keeping it from falling into disrepair as much as possible, and spent a few nights there either alone or with friends. I had never noticed anything wrong with the cottage or the neighborhood. One day after a hard week at work, I decided to spend the weekend outdoors and drove there. I spent Saturday lying on the grass under the apple trees and reading books, and in the evening I had a modest dinner and watched 3.5 channels of an old TV. By the time the nightmare described below began, it was a windless but already cool August night. I turned off the TV and was considering whether to go to bed or to read some more. Just then, in the midst of a silence that you never hear in the city, someone knocked on the door of my house. You will understand my horror, which twisted my stomach and made me feel colder than I had ever felt in my life. When I explain this, the door of the house did not go out into the alley, but into the garden. To get to the porch, one had to enter the property through a gate, follow a path surrounded by plum trees and briars, and in doing so, walk around the house almost the entire perimeter. There was no other way of getting to the door. The property was surrounded by a high netting that was impossible to climb over, except by flying over. I would have guessed that the neighbors were knocking, but it was unlikely to be them because, firstly, the nearest neighbors slept 2 houses away from me. Secondly, normal neighbors would knock at the lighted window overlooking the alley or shout from the street. And thirdly, I closed the gate myself at night with an impressive padlock on the inside. So, when I heard the knock on the door, I experienced inexpressible sensations and probably almost fainted from the fear. While I was thinking about all this, the knock came again. I crossed the room where I'd been watching TV, went into the room that served as a hallway, and froze at the door. The porch was silent. Not a word, not a rustle. I gathered all my willpower and asked in a trembling voice, "Who's there?" I heard a faint mumbling and some giggling in response. It was unbearably scary. I thought I was dreaming and having a nightmare. My head was foggy, my eyes were foggy, and my ears were ringing. After 10 seconds, the mumbling stopped, and I heard a smacking sound. The kind of sound usually made when kisses are voiced in cartoons or cartoon movies. I realized that this wasn't clean, and I had to defend myself somehow. I don't know how I pulled the nightstand away from the wall and put it against the door. There was a rush on the porch and a steady pounding on the door, mixed with louder mumbling and smacking. I jumped out of the room and realized that it was actually incredibly easy to get into the house through the 2 wide windows. All I had to do was break the glass. The only solution for me was to climb into the attic and drag the ladder behind me, which wasn't easy either, and which I also unexpectedly climbed up in a couple of moments. I covered the hatch to the 2nd floor and deftly pressed the ladder in some bags with junk. Once in the attic and catching my breath, I looked around, desperately wondering what to do next. The knocking on the door didn't stop. The other sounds were also perfectly audible. The summer house was built of light materials for leisure, but not defense. I saw a faint light in the attic window overlooking the garden and realized that my porch light was still on. The temptation was unbearable. I jumped up to that window, leaned my face against the dusty glass, and tried to see what was happening at the threshold. I couldn't see the door itself, But what I did see was enough to last me a lifetime. I was on my knees, but my legs gave out so that I fell to the floor and cried. On the part of the porch that I could see, I saw a shapeless dark mass, glowing black and blue in the lantern light. It seemed to swell and bubble, and some outgrowths were constantly stretching out of it and disappearing inside again. It pulsed and wavered, and it seemed that these waves did not end at the volume, but went on through the air, poisoning everything around with horror. But that was not all. Near the porch, in the shadows, I saw two frozen figures. Inhuman figures. Long, thin, armless, like giant matchsticks, they swayed slightly as if in the wind. I couldn't see their eyes, but I knew they were looking at me. I bounced away from the window, fell on the boards, and cried. I heard the pounding stop and the door creak desperately. I heard something crack. Apparently the door lock had broken, and the nightstand rattled across the floor as it was moved. Muttering came from just beneath me. Through the gaps in the loose floorboards, I saw that the lights in the cabin were out. There was no escape. And then a doomed determination came over me. In 2 leaps, I reached the window opposite, which looked out into the alley. Fortunately, it was open. I faintly remember climbing out of it, jumping to the ground into the bushes and probably scratching myself badly. I poorly remember climbing over the wicket, probably jumped over it. I remember that I ran down the alley to the neighbor's house where the lights were on, and I was yelling something, breaking through the gate and afraid to turn around. A neighbor came out to my screams, silently dragged me over the fence without a word, and then there was a lapse in my memory. Apparently, I went into a state of shock, and the fragments of memories are quite difficult to put into a normal narrative. I woke up, or rather, I woke up at my neighbor's house on the veranda. The neighbor was standing and looking at me carefully. I remembered the whole nightmare and I began to shake. The neighbor ordered me to get up and go with him. Together we went to my dacha. The gate was open wide. The door to the house was broken open. The gutted nightstand was floating in a pool in the garden. Every light bulb and electrical fixture in the rooms had been smashed. The hatch to the attic was closed, but covered in some sort of dried slime. The neighbor again said nothing, but took out a coil of copper wire. We began to stretch this wire at a level of 3 centimeters above the ground, along the perimeter of the plot along the fence. Under the gate, the neighbor ordered me to dig a hole about 1.5 meters deep. He went to his house and brought something in a sack. He buried the contents of the bag under the gate. I could not see what it was. I slowly came to my senses and tried to get an explanation from my neighbor. He cut me short. "It's better you don't know. It won't happen again. Still, he asked me to stay off the property during the full moon. You'd think I'd have any desire at all to spend not just a night, but even a day here." By the way, passing by my neighbor's dacha later, I discerned a faded wire running along his fence. I didn't notice anything unusual under the gate. Since then, I have not slept in that house and unsuccessfully tried to sell it. A few times my cousin came from out of town and, with my reluctant permission, slept in the cottage with his friends. He only laughed at the warnings of devilry and said I was overworked at work. My brother never mentioned anything strange during these bouts, and I'm beginning to think that my father's heart attack wasn't due to natural causes. Who these creatures were, what they wanted, the more I think about it, the worse I sleep at night. But after 3 years, I'm beginning to doubt that it happened to me. I think I made it all up, my mind trying to protect itself from the shocking memories. The wire in the fence is torn in several places and should be replaced. Only it seems like a ridiculous joke to me, so I leave it alone. I really want to believe that none of this happened.